All right, we can go ahead and get started. I don't think anybody else is going to join. So, this week is the start of a new month, and so the topic for the month is performance enhancement. This is still going to be through the context of a rehab space, so primarily athletic trainers, but then obviously Dylan's coming in with a PT perspective. So, the performance enhancement side of things and kind of how ATs or PTs can bridge that gap between the medical and performance department. So, the first topic for the week for performance enhancement is speed development. And this is one of my favorite topics. I geek out on all the speed stuff. So, anything biomechanics or anything like neuromuscular with all of that stuff. So I get really into the weeds. Love track and field and gained a new appreciation for it by working with it. So if anybody has interest in speed development, highly suggest working with track and field, or just call Sally and she will tell you everything you need to know. So to give the overview, I kept this really short, really brief. And again, this is not backed by any research. This is just my way of conceptualizing how to develop speed in an injury context. So the first step is similar to any rehab context. You're going to do tissue restoration. You're really trying to get back to your baseline. You're trying to get your normal range of motion, your normal strength, expression of force, those types of things. The next would be more of the performance department typically, but the tissue development. And this is where you're actually trying to create adaptation. And this could be either in terms of force or in terms of structural changes that are actually happening within the musculature. So the architectural changes. And then lastly would be the technical improvement. So this is more of the skill side of things or the postural side of things where you're actually correcting form to either produce the injury prevention side of things, trying to mitigate injury, or on the performance side of things and trying to really push the envelope and get them to become more athletic. So for tissue restoration, kind of the first step for any injury is to decrease pain, because without pain, we obviously know if pain is present, that's going to be a governor on what the muscle's actually outputting. So if somebody has pain, they're not going to be able to contract. In the example of hamstring, for most sprint injuries is going to be hamstring involvement, but it applies to any muscular or ligamentous injury. If you have pain, the muscles are going to be inhibited. So the first step would be to decrease pain so that you can properly express force. Next would be to restore the tissue elasticity, promoting range of motion, doing your typical range of motion exercises. For hamstring specifically, I really like the Askling protocol. They're kind of an introduction to hamstring rehab and doing early stage exercises as tolerated, progressing things like the extenders or the divers, things like that. And then the strength. So you're trying to restore the tissue strength. And this is what I was touching on earlier with the force production. So getting the tissue to actually be able to produce force. So in most professional soccer settings, you're using things that are objectively measuring it. So whether that's a handheld dynamometer, or if you're doing things like the Nordboard, the force plates, or any of the Vald products to measure the force output. You have obviously different ways of expressing force. So that can be slow contraction or it can be a fast contraction. And that would bring you into your last piece where you're looking at the power piece. And so for that, it's a matter of rate of force development. How quickly can you engage the motor units? And then the power is actually like how fast you're moving whatever the object is. So if you've got a bar that's say 135 pounds or 60 kilos. Are you moving that quickly or are you moving that slow? Because that's going to change how the muscles are responding and adapting. Then to the tissue development side of things, this is a concept that I recently discovered. I'd never heard of Charlie Wengroff before, but I really like his philosophy that therapy equals rehab, training equals rehab. And it's just a big continuum. So all we're trying to do is target adaptations and then progress it as appropriate. So if they're not ready for training, full like team weight training, you're just doing a regression or a lateralization. So this concept is really cool. If anybody likes the kind of exercise selection or modification, check out Charlie's work. He's on Instagram, he's on YouTube, got some good stuff. In terms of the adaptation, so there's kind of a few things that you can do, especially in the hamstring return to play. The fascicle length would be one, and that's primarily targeted by eccentric exercise, but can also be modified by stretching, specifically load, prolonged stretching. So if you're holding stretching for short duration, 10 to 20 seconds, it's probably not sufficient to increase the fascicle length. These really need to be held for longer periods of times, upwards of a minute to 2 minutes, and spread throughout the course of a week. So you're probably looking at something like 10 to 14 minutes per week. And then the other would be to decrease the pennation angle. You're trying to create actually more like structural strength through the muscle. And by having a smaller pennation angle, the muscle is better able to contract against resistance. So no surprise here, resistance training is what leads to that adaptation that we're targeting. And then lastly would be to increase the rate of force development and really creating those fast contractions. So those are depending on how you're cueing things. You can tell somebody to just change the way that they're performing or executing the exercise. And then in terms of power, it's how fast they're actually moving the bar. So this is a cue that I give to athletes all the time is keep the same weight, but move it as fast as you possibly can. One, it's going to lead to more fatigue and more adaptation. But two, it's always going to make them more athletic if they're moving the same weight faster. Any comments, questions so far?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Could you just get into the pennation angle? That's just a term I'm not as familiar with.
Yeah, so that is the if you look at like the muscle under a microscope, you're looking at the angle of the muscle fiber as it aligns with the tendon. And so, for example, if your pennation angle is really steep, like my two hands right now, the contraction speed happens a lot faster, but it's a lot weaker. It's a lot less contact points. Whereas if you have a more acute pennation angle where you're here, then you have a lot more overlap and you give a lot more kind of grip, if you will, for the actin and the myosin that are sliding in that sliding filament theory. So it's a quick and easy like concept to understand. If you just give a quick like Google search, it'll show you different pennation angles. I'm not like an expert in that field, so I don't know in terms of like degrees of change. I don't know like what would be a sufficient change in pennation angle. I know it's not drastic. You're not going from like a 45 degree to a 90, but I don't know in terms of like 1 degree pennation angle, is that sufficient, or 2 degrees, 5 degrees? I don't know exactly like the specifics of it, but as a concept, it's a result as you increase resistance training, your pennation angle starts to decrease, especially as you load up heavier weights. I don't know,
Got it.
Chris or Sally, if you have anything to add to that or anything that I might be getting wrong.
Yeah, so essentially what you're saying is if you can line up the actin and myosin better, then you have a better contraction and better motor recruitment, essentially. If you have more motor recruitment, you can theoretically produce more force.
I believe that to be correct, yes. Not 100% sure, but I believe that to be correct.
Yeah, and I was just going to go back to the beginning of that slide. My old strength coach, he would always say, you know, the best training is the best rehab, and the best rehab is the best training. So now I know where he got it from. But that like whole mentality kind of changed how we did things at that organization. So it was kind of a good blend between the two. So the transition between, you know, us to the weight room was pretty seamless for the most part, because I mean we were all kind of on the same page. You know, we were all building towards the same thing, and you know, the more we can collaborate between all of us, it was easier just to, hey, they're doing rehab in their training in the weight room, but they're also doing lifts in the rehab. So it was just a good mentality change for me, who was kind of still in the very basics of, you know, grad school classes of all the basic exercises. So
yeah, 100%. I think it's common for ATs to kind of fear the gym, or if they're in the team lift, I think they kind of They're like the fly on the wall. They don't really want to give any wrong cues, or they don't really want to interfere with like the lifting and things like that. So I think anytime you have a chance to better understand exercise and what that does in terms of adaptations, I think that's a good thing in terms of adding tools to your toolbox. Cool. So then it brings us to the technical improvement. So like mathematically, there's really only a couple of things you can do to increase somebody's velocity. It's increasing stride length, or it's increasing stride frequency. And so there's different ways that you can go about trying to increase like stride length, for example. If somebody's really weak, they tend to have really fast stride frequency, but they can only stride so long. So by getting them stronger, you're going to increase their ability to produce force, and then that's going to translate to them pushing off the ground harder, increasing their stride length. So that's why people can get stronger and then get faster. But there is a ceiling to that. If they're on the other side of the spectrum and they're crazy strong, but they're really, really slow contraction, then they're going to have really strong, like powerful strides, but it's a really slow frequency. So these guys, or these types of runners, tend to have pretty big strides, but it takes them a lot longer on the ground. Their ground contact times are probably twice as long as some of these other faster sprinters. So a couple of variables you can pay attention to and try to manipulate, especially in the rehab setting. So if you're trying to increase the ability for somebody to run faster, one of the things you can do is tell them to stride longer. And so what that will do is one of two things. Either they will start to adapt to that and they start to get stronger and they start to absorb the forces better, or they will overstride and then they're going so long that their ground contact times just start to increase. So they're not actually running any faster. They're just increasing. They're swapping their stride length for their stride frequency. So there's regressions and there's progressions along that stride length continuum. And so in a rehab, for example, a lot of times what we'll do is just have somebody start with like simple little jogs, or you could even have them doing it and standing. You just have them practice like their cyclical movements, have them doing maybe like an A skip, or have them do ankling exercises, things like that, where you're just literally standing, and then progress it up to slower speeds, maybe 50% speed, really, really controlled jog. And then you build up to maybe it's a 60%, 70%, 80% stride frequency or stride length. You can manipulate either of those variables very easily in a rehab context. You just have to be aware of what the consequences are. If you go so fast, like if you're only trying to do fast feet, you get these really short, choppy steps and you don't actually go anywhere. Versus the opposite is if you take really long, powerful bounds, then you spend too long on the ground and you're not running as fast either. So there's a balance there. If you want your athlete to be running max speed, they have to find what's optimal in terms of their stride length and their stride frequency. For the form correction, so there's all kinds of things. I mean, we could spend 6 years talking about form and optimal biomechanics for sprinting, but generally speaking, the pros of correcting form are going to be the long-term changes. These are health and performance benefits. So you're going to make somebody have better biomechanics. That's going to optimize their force production, their ground contact time, things like that. And you're also going to mitigate the risk of injury there. So one example that's commonly talked about is an anterior pelvic tilt. I would argue that every track sprinter in the world has an anterior pelvic tilt, and that's probably not the risk factor, but it definitely is a risk factor. So if somebody's like incredibly anteriorly tilted, the form correction would be teaching them to hold a better posture as they're sprinting. Now, that's not going to come naturally to them. That's going to take a long time to train that habit. And you might not ever get it to the point where it's neutral, but at least you're getting it to the point where their hamstrings aren't overstretched as they get into that late swing phase. So the con is that it's going to take a long time to change somebody's form or break somebody's habits. So kind of know what you're dealing with in terms of a rehab. In a soccer setting, if you've got 2 weeks to work with somebody, that's probably not enough time to correct their form. Maybe you sprinkle in some stuff in the warm-up. Maybe you have a couple of small cues you're giving them. But in a short-term rehab, you just don't have enough time to focus on these things. So you're going to focus more on the stride length, stride frequency, and the tissue restoration as opposed to the technical improvement. Now, if you've got a long-term rehab and you've got like an ACL and you're going to spend a lot of time working on running form, then for sure you can maximize some of these adaptations. You can definitely take somebody through and correct some of their bad habits. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Cool. Keep it moving. For the literature review, I could have written an article about all of the different sources that I found helpful throughout the last week, let alone like my athletic training career. So kept it short to 3 and 3. The first one is a LinkedIn post from Les Spellman talking about quantifying sprint load and how he measures different loading principles. So you're talking about things like X cells and D cells, you're talking about sprint distance, high speed running distance, all of these different variables that are included in not only return to play, but also in healthy athletes for load monitoring, and how he kind of systematizes the bigger picture of how all of these things are contributing to an athlete's overall workload. Boo Schexnayder has a PDF that's out called Common Sense Rehab Principles, and this is I think it's like 2 pages, but it's really short, kind of bullet points, but really they're really simple topics, but not a lot of people apply them when they're doing rehab. They're too busy thinking about the nuances of the injury or the specifics of what their rehab is trying to target. And so they miss out some of these common sense things. So I think it's helpful to at least read through this once to keep in the back of your mind. Cal Dietz Triphasic Training is a book. I am sadly not getting commission for pushing this on everybody, but it's a really good book. It's a bit older now. I don't know exactly when it came out, but I know he also has an updated version, Triphasic Training 2. And this book is really helpful in terms of breaking down the different types of contractions and when it's appropriate to train them separately. So when you want to target the eccentric, or when you want to target the isometric, when you want to target the concentric. So breaking down the different types of contractions and kind of maximizing or optimizing the utilization of all of them. For media, Boo Schexnayder, again, he's in the track and field space, and he's a bit of a legend. Pretty much everybody knows who he is, but he's got a really good video on speed development, injury rehab, and lessons that he's learned through his 40-year coaching career. This was a podcast. I don't remember. I think it was Human Kinetics that published it, but he had a really good podcast that he was on talking about all of those different topics that are relevant for this week. Dan Pfaff is another legend in the track and field space, and he's got a presentation. I think it was at like a live conference, but he was on a track working with an athlete and kind of demonstrating how his mechanics were and how he should be training for the injury that he was dealing with. I think it's about 20 minutes, but it's worth the watch. And then lastly is Tony Holler. He's got another short video on YouTube, I think maybe 10 to 15 minutes, talking about sprint mechanics. And this is something that I refer back to often. It's a really simple kind of elementary level introduction to sprint mechanics and what you should be looking for, such as high knee, front side mechanics versus backside mechanics, driving down into the ground to create vertical force when you're at max speed versus horizontal force when you're accelerating, things like that. So really helpful if you're new to this, but also it's really simple and just kind of paints a clear picture. So even if you've been doing it for a while, just kind of helps you to solidify the understanding of those topics. Comments, questions, concerns? Anybody got any cool stories?
Yeah, I'll just mention real quick. I like the idea of like a common sense rehab approach. I was recently talking to an athletic trainer that I've been shadowing, and he had like some chronic hip pain he'd been dealing with for a long time. And I think sometimes it's tough when you're somebody who has a lot of knowledge in terms of biomechanics and how the body works, because he was asking me questions about it, and he was giving me like, oh, like I think my pelvis is anteriorly tilted a bit this way and elevated in this way. And I think sometimes it can get very muddy if you look at it like that. I think if you just revert back to identifying what exactly is impaired, right? What is it? Your strength? Is it your power development? Is it your range of motion? And then try to improve what's limited and take that approach as opposed to looking at everything under a microscope. I think it can help make things a lot more simple.
I forget which video that was in. I think it was Boo Schexnayder, maybe it was Dan Pfaff. One of those videos they were talking about that exact thing and not staring at one body part and thinking about, oh, my foot's over pronating. Oh, my big toe doesn't have enough extension to get into a push off. Oh, my left hip rotates slightly more than my right, something like that. But yeah, it can be very easy to lose the forest from the trees when you're looking at some of these details, especially when you start to learn some of these nuances. You kind of hone in on them as opposed to just looking at the holistic picture of what's this athlete move like. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think it is in the Dan Pfaff video. So if you want to learn more about that, I would highly suggest watching that video.
Right. And following up from what Dylan was mentioning, I think that all goes back to the one conversation that we had about like looking at the joint above and under. I think it all always revolves back to that, knowing that like you were just mentioning like, oh, my greater toe's not moving, but like how's my foot looking? Like, is my foot doing anything? Like, is it my ankle? If I get that range of motion at the greater toe, yes, it's probably going to help me, but what else do I need to do to make sure that I don't lose that range of motion? And going back to a few slides, Chris mentioned how he's previous head athletic trainer or something like that, how training and rehab would go together. Like that's something that I've been doing with my post-op athletes. If I already introduced the exercise within the athletic training room and I know that they have the cues, I've spoke with our strength coaches and said like, hey, these exercises they are able to do with you, so that I can introduce new movement to then have them do it with you so that they can start adding weight and all that stuff. They might not be clear for a full lift, but the range of like the exercises through a pain-free range of motion and a range of motion that they're allowed to, they're able to do it during lift. Not only does that allow them to continue to be with the team, lift with the team, feel like they're doing something, but it also helps on the mental health aspect, which is something super important when you're trying to have an athlete buy in to what you're trying to sell them within the rehab.
And to add to that, the other thing that it does within the larger staff is it allows your strength coach to better prescribe workouts because they already know what they're getting when they come into the gym. A lot of times it seems like that handoff can be very messy, and the AT might say, "Oh, they're ready for gym," but like, what kind of gym are we talking about here? Because it's very different if you're talking about body weight squat versus 315-pound back squat, things like that. So it's important to speak the same language as your strength and conditioning staff to make sure that they know what they're getting when you hand them over or when you start to collaborate between that space.
Right. And as ATs, I want to say, from my experience, I either meet with my strength coach or send him an email with the injury report, as well as the coaches. And I try to be like specific, like, hey, you can do lower extremity with this person. I'm okay with them doing this is exercise, but no plyos, no impact. Let's just keep it to body weight stuff, blah, blah, blah. I know I have a few friends in the minor leagues in baseball, and they meet, I want to say, every morning or every Monday to kind of like come up with a plan for each athlete that it's injured and what restrictions they have. So communication, obviously, key in the whole process.
Yeah, we meet every morning and every afternoon we have a medical performance meeting twice a day. So we're talking about things that are changing on a day-to-day basis. I don't know, Chris, if you are free, if you can share maybe what you guys do there.
We're kind of not as structured. We obviously like get together and talk about certain things that we may be dealing with at the time, just while we're in conversation. And that's how it just kind of goes. So yeah.
But yeah, you're still sharing, even if you're not having a formal meeting, you're still sharing that information on a daily basis. You're still meeting with those various support staff to have those conversations. When I was with the academy, we were similar. I think we would have had like morning meetings only, and then the afternoon was kind of just like maybe we were in the team gym discussing some of those things, or just in passing if we saw one another at like the cafeteria or anything like that, just having those conversations throughout the day. But yeah, to Sally's point, you're just sharing information to make sure everybody's on the same page with what the plan is moving forward. So that will bring us to our publication review. And for this week, went back to the scientific literature. Last week, we were talking about travel complications, and that was very tough to find any kind of scientific literature for complications that you might run into while traveling. So going back to the more scientific side of things here, this was a reliability study, and what they were looking to do was to replicate curvilinear running with a soccer. It was semi-professional soccer team that they were testing it on, but they were trying to apply it to a rehab and a performance context to see, one, could they create a test that was repeatable and was it reliable? But then two, they wanted to compare curved sprinting to linear sprinting to see if there were similarities and differences between the two. And so the study had 40 semi-pro soccer players involved in the study that tested on 2 separate days. So they had kind of an instructional period where they gave the lay of the land, or the 2 different tests that they were going to be doing. So one was obviously just a linear sprint, and it was 17 meters. That was selected based on the length of the curve surrounding the penalty spot. So on a soccer field, there's a semicircle that's around the penalty box that gives enough room. I believe it's 9.15 meters away from the penalty spot, so that there's enough room for that penalty kick taker to take that shot. So they were just using the line that was already on the field to replicate that curve. And so they had 3 different checkpoints. One was at 0 meters, so at the starting line. One was at the halfway point, and that was 8.5 meters. And then the last one was at the finish, which was 17 meters. So for the linear, they were replicating that distance to test kind of more of an acceleration as opposed to a true top end sprint. But the findings were that the curvilinear run test was reliable. They were easily able to repeat it and get similar results between individuals. This is unsurprising because the line on the field is not moving, and the conditions out in the like weather and stuff like that isn't going to influence the testing that significantly. So they were using the penalty arc for the consistency. And like I said, they had the 17-meter sprint, 9.15 meter radius of that circle, and then the 8.5 meter checkpoint halfway through the curve, so that they could see how these different individuals were kind of progressing along that curve. Were they really fast to get through the first 8.5 and then slower on the back end once they got up to speed, or was it the other way around? For the relationship between the linear and the curvilinear, the study found that there were separate physical and technical skills that were involved in the curvilinear running. So one of the things that was said was that hamstrings will have different activation patterns. And this has been known in the track and field community for a while, but your inside leg and your outside leg are going to have different EMG activity if you put EMG on somebody when they run a curve. So you've got different medial and lateral hamstring activation. You've got different hip internal, external rotation patterns that are happening. You've got low back EMG activity would show differences. So all of these things are showing that you're getting more internal, or you're going to have your demands across your inside leg and your outside leg are going to be slightly different depending on which body part you're looking at. The linear sprint only explained 35% of the variance of the curvilinear sprint results. And so they're saying is that there's a lot of technical element to it. The ability to run a curved sprint, and this was shown in a baseball study previously as well. It's not just how fast you are, it's a skill to be able to kind of like neurologically perceive what the angle of your curve is that you're running, and also like how well your body's responding to the forces that you're demanding of it. And then to reiterate that point, faster linear athletes were not always the same faster curvilinear athletes. So there's some athletes were slower linearly, and they just got out of the acceleration phase really slowly, but they ran the curve really well. So there's a technical and a physical element to curved running. And they go on to suggest that should kind of lay the land or the foundation for a rehab and for performance in terms of assessing and returning to the curvilinear running, because that's the demands of the sport. And then the last piece that they highlighted was that the curvilinear skill was symmetrical. So running both the curved run to your left and to your right were pretty similar. And those who were fast at running to their left were also fast running to their right. This was a surprise to the authors because they thought that like a right winger is going to make a lot more left leaning curved runs, or a left winger is going to make a lot more curved runs to the right. But this is actually not the case. And this kind of emphasizes the point that it's a neural calculation and it's a skill technically to be able to run curved runs. It's not just positional habits. Any comments, questions about the study? Any experience? Any of you use curved running in your rehabs?
I tend to use it, especially with quad and hamstring. Return to place, just because honestly, no one's ever running in a straight line, so it's always nice to have. But using the semicircle from the box is actually a great idea that I had never thought about doing. I just kind of lay cones down and I'm like run around it. Now they have like a for sure line they can follow, which is nice.
So like when you have the cones that lay out the curve, how are you measuring either the length of the curve or the angle of the curve, like how tight or how steep that curve is?
I usually do about 20 yards total. And then I'll have them like 5 yards out to the right, 5 yards out to the left, and then it's like every 5 yards I'll have them go on a curve. So it's fun to set up, but if I could just use this in my circle, it's probably gonna be a lot easier.
I saw this paper originally on LinkedIn, and the thumbnail for it was kind of cool and like sparked a lot of interesting ideas in my mind. It wasn't just like a one curve effort, which I think is common. It was showing all kinds of different curves that you can set up. So you can have them start in a linear sprint and then start to curve, similar to like if they were pressing one of the outside backs and then the ball gets swung around to the goalkeeper, then they can start to curve their run as the ball gets played across. So not only having predictable curved running, I think it's also important to get them exposure to the unpredictable or the unannounced side of curved running. The other thing that they were showing was that sometimes they're going to have to make a double curved run. So they're getting off of one curve, maybe going to the left, and they get into a curve going to the right. And I've seen that before in a rehab context for an ACL. I saw there was a physical therapist who was using it. Basically, they set up like a figure eight of cones. And so they had their athlete run around one circle and then double back around the other side. And then that gets the exposure to both the left and to the right. Anybody else have any curved running rehab that they do?
Most of the folks I see.
Go ahead, Dylan.
Sorry. I was just going to say most of the folks I see at this point in my career do not do a whole lot of curve running, but I will get there. And now I know a good place to start.
I don't really do a lot of like curve running usually because my one primary sport is going to be basketball. So like I try to like do more reaction stuff. For our track athletes, we basically like we were mentioning training and recovery and rehab. We have our coaches kind of like have them run curves during practice. We kind of like get a feeling of like, okay, I can do this 50%, 70%, whatever percentage they're able to get through their speed. But yeah, I usually go more with like reactions. Yes, I'll use the cones to kind of like do more of like side shuffle type of thing. But I will say that when I'm doing my functional testing, depending on the position that I am, like if it's a forward, if it's a guard, I'll have the athlete, let's say it's a shooting guard, I'll have the athlete coming off like the screen, which could be kind of like a curve. But that would be mostly it. I don't really use it as training per se, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's definitely less relevant in basketball. Like, there's not that many actions where you're going to have a curved run. I guess one that I could think of would be like if they're down by the baseline, making a run on a down screen, and then they're coming up and around the 3-point line. That's probably like the closest action you're going to see to that. So maybe if you've got some kind of a quad or a hamstring strain that you're doing rehab with, that would be your exposure to a curved run. And you could do both on the left wing and on the right wing to kind of get it with that. And you could probably just use the curve of the basketball or the 3-point line. I don't imagine it's that dissimilar to the penalty spot. So I think you could get your curved running in that way if you wanted to have that progression. Something that kind of triggered when you were talking about your track progressions would be the use of the different, I guess, the angle of the curve. So if you're on the inside lane, you know that's a lot steeper of a curve, right? So maybe you have them, if you're going to have them start to run some curves, you have them in the outside lane to gradually ease them into it. And it's just like any other progression there. You want to get them to the point where they can do the outside lane comfortably and then progress into maybe 2 lanes in at a time, and then start to change that angle of the curved run as they get closer and closer to that inside lane. Cool. The takeaways that they were suggesting, I already touched on this, but they were suggesting that the medical can use it, the strength and conditioning staff can use it, and the sports science staff can use the curvilinear running in terms of assessing it, but then also in terms of training for it. So it's a skill. We know that it's a skill. We know that there's a physical element to it, and we know that that can be helpful in terms of muscular development. So if you have a specific hamstring strain, maybe you want to do more left-sided running or more right-sided running, but you're probably going to want to get some kind of curved exposure in their rehab. So to wrap things up, there's kind of 3 buckets that fall into my rehab themes, and that would be tissue restoration, kind of getting them back to their baseline. There's tissue development, trying to push them beyond where they currently are. And then there's a technical improvement where you're trying to modify some of the more postural things, more of the alignment and the tempo of different things. So you're trying to manipulate those variables in order to either reduce the likelihood of re-injury or to progress the rehab. Any final comments, questions, anything anybody wants to discuss for more detail? All good? Cool. So that will wrap it up for this week. And sticking with the performance enhancement side of things, we'll dig into the nitty gritty with power development in rehab, talking about the development primarily in the gym, but also how you're going to translate these things into more power-based plyometrics and things like that. So training the power kind of in the end stage of your rehab. Hope to see you all there, and take care and enjoy the rest of your week.